My second year of learning Chinese was largely spent in Taiwan, where I learned a lot, despite not always using the best approach. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I will continue sharing the story of how I learned Chinese. But before I do that, I'd like to announce that there is a Chinese reading challenge starting on March 10th and lasting until the end of the month. And as usual, these challenges are meant to push you to do a little bit more studying than you normally do. And this month, the focus is on reading. And if you want advice for what to read or how to read, I will put links to that in the description. And you can also check out the challenge over at challenges.hackingchinese.com. If you listen to this in the future, you can still head over there to see what challenge is on when you are listening. That being out of the way, let's continue with the story of how I learned Chinese. And this is part 3, and I will do my best to summarize parts 1 and 2 here. But if you want to listen to them in full, they were episodes 128 and 131. So to summarize briefly, I started learning Chinese mostly on a whim, on a recommendation from 2 friends. And this was after I already had an interest in Chinese philosophy and Chinese culture, and also Chinese martial arts. But this was not at all guaranteed to lead to language studies, and this was not at all the plan when I started. I then spent 1 year in Sweden studying in a fairly traditional but intensive language program, and during this year I acquired a scholarship to go to Taiwan to study for 1 year full-time, and this is what I will talk about in this episode. I already started talking a little bit about my experience in Taiwan in the previous episode because I used that as a way to gauge how much Chinese I learned in the first year. So when I arrived in Taiwan, I felt that I knew a lot of words, a lot of grammar, but I didn't have enough practice to be able to use these with any kind of fluency, and I struggled particularly with listening because even though I could piece together sentences and say them and make people understand what I said, I rarely understood what other people said to me, and that is a big problem if you want to communicate. One of the biggest differences with studying in an immersion environment and studying in your home country is that the language is everywhere around you. So you can't really escape listening practice. You will hear people speak around you, you will hear announcements, and so on. And you will also see the language written on billboards, and in general, the language is very accessible. This can, of course, be replicated in your home country, but you need to make a lot of effort to make this happen. Whereas if you live abroad, this will just happen, whether you like it or not. In addition to this, I also studied full-time as required by the scholarship that I received, and this means 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, for a total of 15 hours a week. And that doesn't sound like much, but if you also include that you have homework, you need to prepare for exams, you need to review and so on, you actually do get up to 40 hours, at least if you're reasonably serious about what you're doing and the course you are in is not too easy for you. Beyond the things that I listed, there are of course many other things you can do that will greatly improve your Chinese, such as just socializing with people, making friends, practicing sports, traveling, and so on. And these are normally not counted as studying, but are of course hugely beneficial if done right as well. If I were to pick one thing that I think I did well during my first year in Taiwan, it is that I did not speak a lot of English, I did not get stuck in an expat bubble, but did indeed spend most of the time speaking Chinese, either with classmates or with native speakers. So let's describe the situation in more concrete terms. I started learning Chinese in 2007, and this was after 1 year, so I arrived in Taiwan in August or maybe early September 2008. Which means that this episode covers the period from that autumn semester, including the spring semester, until the summer 2009. I started the first semester with studies at Zhonghua Daxue, which is a technical university outside of Hsinchu in northwestern Taiwan. And the story of how I ended up there is a bit peculiar, and I hinted at it in last episode when I said that I kind of failed to understand how the scholarship worked. So I was actually supposed to apply for a university in parallel with the scholarship application, but I thought that was done after you got the scholarship. So essentially, they told me, hey, you can get this scholarship, but we need to see which university you were admitted to as well. And I hadn't even applied. And that was something that could be solved, but I was in a hurry, so I checked all the universities on the official list. I sent emails to all of them and tried to contact all of them, and then basically I decided which one to go to, based mainly on how willing they were to cooperate and respond to my questions. And to be honest, most universities didn't reply at all, and one that did and also was very helpful was 中华大学, so that's where I went. When I tell this story to Taiwanese people, they are rather surprised. I think very few foreigners go there, and even fewer go there to study Chinese. There are a lot of engineering students that go there on scholarships to learn other things, usually a bachelor's degree in some technical subject or maybe a master's degree, but there are very few people who go to 中华大学 to learn Chinese primarily. I was probably the only one, at least when I was there. This was almost 15 years ago, but I remember very clearly what it was like to arrive in Taiwan. This was the first time I had stayed abroad for longer than a few weeks, and I went there on my own. I knew almost nothing about the situation I would be in, and it was a big adventure. And in general, everything went very smoothly. It was all very overwhelming, but usually in a positive way. The university also did everything they could to help me out. They assigned people to help me, they've helped me find an apartment to live in, and so on. And all this made me feel very welcome. I think maybe this was an advantage of going to a university which didn't accept hundreds of foreigners learning Chinese every semester, so maybe they valued each student a little bit more highly. So going to class was an interesting experience because I was behind all my classmates. They had all been in Taiwan maybe for a semester, sometimes for up to a year, and they had been immersed in the language for all that time and gone to class and so on. And even if most of them did other things as well, they were still well ahead of me in terms of proficiency. I have a note in my language logs saying that I understood almost 50% of what was said in class, and that is not a lot, and it certainly makes you feel out of your depth. And this is a consequence of having attended mostly lessons that weren't entirely in Chinese, because the lessons I'd taken in Sweden were good, they contained some Chinese, we did lots of practicing and so on, but they weren't non-stop input in Chinese. But when learning Chinese in Taiwan, it's not necessarily the case that all your classmates speak English, and so the teacher will usually stick to mostly Chinese and maybe add a little bit of English now and then. Having classmates who are not native speakers of English is sometimes a benefit because it makes it very natural to speak Chinese with everyone, because that is indeed a language that is the best for communicative purposes. Unless if you're studying with people who speak English, it's very easy to resort to English when you can't communicate. So I would say I spent a few months adapting to the course and to the environment and to people around me, the culture and so on. And also, of course, the language, because as most of you know, Chinese comes in many varieties, and the way people speak in Taiwan is not the same as in Beijing, which is not the same as in Hong Kong and so on. The differences are not huge, especially not if we're comparing the standard languages. They are indeed very similar, but then again, people don't always follow the standards, and then the colloquial way that people speak can be very different. And this, of course, took a while getting used to. I also needed to convert what I had learned in my first year to traditional characters, which took a while but wasn't as hard as I thought once I had gotten into it. It did feel very difficult at the beginning because, well, some characters just look very different, but once you have converted and learned the basic components, you can see that most of the changes are actually systematic, and once you've learned one case, you've basically learned a lot of other very easy cases, and then you're left with a few hundred very difficult ones that kind of feel like new characters. But that's not so bad if you've already learned thousands of characters anyway. Naturally, I didn't spend all my time in class or with my nose in a textbook. I also spent as much time as I could socializing with people around me. And as a rather introvert person, this is something that I couldn't do really spontaneously. I found that very difficult. So I figured that if I can find some kind of interest that I have in common with other people, that would make it easier. And this is a principle that I've exploited a lot, and I will talk more about it later. But for example, if you find people to do language exchange with, you have some reason to meet people and you have something to talk about. And that makes it a lot easier, at least compared with chatting up random strangers or trying to make friends in a more natural way, whatever that means. I also should point out that language exchanges are not beneficial only because you are able to study Chinese while teaching some other language to this person. It's also great because you gain access to social circles you wouldn't otherwise, because your language exchange partner is very likely to invite you to lots of social events, cultural events, sports, or whatever it might be. And thus you expand your social network a lot, and it's not just limited to meeting someone once or twice a week, talking about grammar, new words, or having basic conversations. Another way I found very useful to get in touch with native speakers and practice Chinese outside of language learning situations was to practice sports. So before leaving for Taiwan, I practiced diving, and this is something I did at an amateur level, of course. I started learning just a few years earlier in Sweden. But then in my second semester in Taiwan, I had the opportunity to practice diving with Taiwanese people, and that was rather interesting. And getting coached in a foreign language and conversing with the other divers and so on. I didn't do this as much as I would have wished to, but it was still rather interesting. I also practiced a limited amount of other sports, including swimming, some football, and also some taiji quan, and these are all great opportunities to get to know native speakers and also learn a lot of Chinese. So I kept busy with these things for a few months, but I gradually realized that this setup wouldn't work for very long. And there were two reasons for this. The first was that the classes that I took were held in the evening. And this was to accommodate people who studied in degree programs or maybe who worked during the day, and so they would only have time to study Chinese in the evening. I, however, studied full time, and this was an issue because during the days I had time, but other people typically did not have time during the day. And so when I had time, nobody was around. But then in the evening, when everybody else had time, well, I had to go to class. And this means that it was hard sometimes to utilize the time in a meaningful manner. Because if you are abroad, especially if you're abroad for a limited amount of time, you typically don't want to spend most of your time in a textbook, because you can do that at home after you get back or before you go abroad, so there is little need to do this in an immersion environment. The other problem was related to this, and that is that most of my classmates were actually studying other things or doing other things with their time. Learning Chinese was not their main goal. Some of them mostly spent the time they had in class, and some of them did their homework as well, but this is not really comparable to me spending all the time I had learning as much as I could. So that means that even though I found the course very difficult in the first month, it was actually rather easy towards the end, and this was also the most advanced course that was offered, so I couldn't switch up, I couldn't do anything really, and I knew that if I stayed in this class, I wouldn't really benefit that much from the lessons, and I would have to do all my learning on my own. Which would again be very hard because I would be busy in the evenings, and I had to take the courses for the scholarship. And thus I decided to switch universities. And this time I did have more time to research and choose a place that would be more suitable and that had a broader range of courses and also would be better in other regards. I ended up going to Wenzhou Waiyu Xueyuan in Kaohsiung, so that's in southern Taiwan, and it's called a university now, but it was a college back when I studied there. As the name implies, we have Waiyu in the name, which means foreign languages. So basically every single person on campus was interested in languages in some way. Some studied interpretation, translation, some were going to be language teachers, and so on. This made it very easy to find people who had similar interests, and since all my classes were now in the day, it was also much easier to socialize with people in the evenings. The language center they had was also a lot bigger, and if I'm not mistaken, they had something like 150 students, whereas my previous university only had maybe 30 students in total. This also meant a much broader range of courses being offered, and that was very beneficial for me, which is something that I have talked about on the podcast before. I'll put a link in the description to the episode where I talk about this in more detail, but in brief, I first started in a course that was roughly where I was supposed to be, but then again I realized, well, I can probably learn faster than this, and still many of my classmates are not doing this as their main occupation, they are doing this on the side. And so I decided to up the game significantly and enrolled in a much more difficult class, deliberately putting myself in a situation where I had to study a lot to keep up the pace and to also try to catch up with my classmates. Well, they had studied Chinese for much longer than I had, and there was no way I would catch up with them in just a few months, but at least I could catch up with them locally for the specific chapters we studied by preparing a lot more and by reviewing a lot more and so on. I turned out okay in this course, and I also learned an awful lot, but it also came at a price. So I think it's rather interesting that I started my first year in Taiwan roughly with the problem that I would then also have at the end of the first year. And if you recall, I talked about not being very good at the things that I did know. Well, I knew lots of words and grammar, but I didn't know how to use them fluently. I had to think too much to recall the meaning of words and so on. And that simply doesn't work when you're listening to someone speaking with you. You need to be really good and understand things much more quickly than I did. Well, because I always strive to find more difficult courses and try to challenge myself as much as possible, I ended up spending a lot of time learning things that were actually very hard. So, to give an example here, in my second semester here, when I studied at Wenzhou, we studied a book called Media Chinese, which contains authentic newspaper articles. And if you have read Chinese newspaper articles, you know that this is much harder than the content in any of the main textbook series. So in order to cope with this, I had to spend a lot of time previewing. I remember spending maybe 3 hours preparing for each lesson, and of course each lesson here is 3 hours, so a 1-to-1 ratio is not too bad. But when we're talking about reading texts that are so hard that you have 100 new words for a one-page article, the consequence is that you are not covering a lot of text. So what I'm saying here is that even though I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours reading Chinese, I didn't actually read that much Chinese if we count the number of characters that I covered when reading. Compare this with if I had spent hundreds and hundreds of hours reading, say, graded readers or easier text in Chinese. I could easily have covered 10, 20, maybe 50 times as much text, and that would have provided me with a more stable foundation to build more advanced language skills on. But now it's a little bit like a card house. I keep building upwards based on what I know already, and it gets more and more advanced, but the foundation is still rather shaky. So one of the results of this is that after spending, well, 9-10 months in Taiwan studying full-time, I still struggled with certain aspects of reading and listening. So for reading, the problem wasn't really that I couldn't read and understand text, because, well, I could read newspaper articles with some guidance, and that means I could probably read most text even though it wasn't very easy. However, I was pretty bad at reading easier texts quickly. So this is something that turned out to be a problem for proficiency exams, for example, because while I thought the texts on these exams were pretty easy, I didn't have time to finish them. And this is also something I've talked about in a specific article on Hacking Chinese, and I'll put a link to that in the description. When it comes to listening, it's also the case that being really good at the basic fundamentals of the language is extremely important. And you don't really benefit that much from having a passive vocabulary that you have to think a little bit about before you figure out what something means, which kind of works if you're reading and you have time because, well, you can take 10-15 seconds and say, yeah, this is what this means. But with listening, that doesn't work because if you need to stop and think for just a few seconds about what something means, the person will have finished their sentence and will be halfway into the next sentence before you pick the conversation back up again, and then you have no idea what they're saying. In other words, this kind of card house competence is very good for some things. It works very well in class, for example. It works when you are the one who's speaking or writing, but it doesn't work very well when you're reading, at least if you have some time pressure, and it doesn't work very well when listening either, at least if you can't ask questions or if you can control the pace in some way. So I think one key component that I lacked and that I would go back and change if I had a time machine is that I would spend much more time on easier content and not spend so much time deciphering very difficult texts. I am actually working on a series of articles and episodes talking specifically about what I would have changed with my own learning if I had a time machine, and the lack of extensive reading and extensive listening would be top of the list for my first year in Taiwan. Still, I managed to learn an awful lot, and especially being in an immersion environment was very helpful because I would never had the opportunities to practice, say, speaking and listening and conversing in Chinese if I would have stayed in Sweden. And indeed, I probably wouldn't have continued learning Chinese if I had stayed in Sweden either. I should also say that if you have studied Chinese in a traditional, typical, formal educational setting, it could be that you're not very good at communicating right out of the gate. But if you go abroad and you give yourself some time to get adjusted, you will quickly figure out how to use the things you have learned in real-world conversation. So just because you feel that you can't communicate and do things you want to be able to do in Chinese after studying a certain number of years in your home country, it's not that the effort is completely wasted, it's just that it will take some time to convert it into practically useful communicative ability. But that is much easier than it would have been to learn everything from scratch. So to round this off, how much Chinese did I learn in some kind of objective terms? Well, that is sadly a little bit hard to answer, because while I did take notes and have language reports written throughout this period, I sometimes were very relative, as in one report referred back to the previous report and said what areas I had improved in and what the qualitative differences were, but this particular report did not say much about concrete situations I could or could not deal with, so it's difficult to say now, 14 years later, what my Chinese was like. But I was certainly able to talk about everyday topics with some fluency and also about more specific topics, such as news articles we studied in class, but with some support and, of course, with much less fluency. The progress report states that I had learned about 5,800 words at the time, and it doesn't make a mention of exactly how many unique characters that means, but it does mention that I could write about half of them by hand. This is maybe also something that I would have changed if I could go back to my first year in Taiwan. I should have spent less time writing characters and more time listening and reading, so the same extensive listening and reading I mentioned earlier. During my second year in Taiwan, I tried to spend less time on things I realized I could equally well learn at home later. This was mainly things like reading and writing, and I tried to spend more time with things that were so much easier to do in situ, i.e. listening and speaking. Since I have been referring to my first year in Taiwan, you of course know that there is more than 1 year. There are in fact 4 years in total, although I will not make one episode about each year. But in the next episode, I will talk about my second year in Taiwan, because even though I didn't get a scholarship to do that, I realized that after my first year, I knew a lot more than when I came to Taiwan, obviously, but I didn't really know enough to do something with Chinese professionally. Sure, I could converse with people, but if I wanted to teach or do anything else with Chinese, I knew that I needed more than that, and so I decided to stay for another year. But more about that in the next episode in this series. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.